Okay, we'll go to item number 12, House Bill 297, Campaign Finance Amendments. Representative King, Representative Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate very much the opportunity to appear before a committee that I was formerly a member of. This bill, HB 297, is a bill that I have run before. It involves a different approach than what we've had traditionally here in Utah in terms of campaign finance disclosures and limits. We have in Utah traditionally taken the approach with regard to regulation of campaign finance contributions, campaign contributions of transparency and disclosure. We've said the way that we're going to handle this is to have individuals who will disclose how much they contribute to candidates, whether they're individuals or whether they're corporations or whether they're PACs. Has to be filed. The candidate has to disclose at regular intervals the contributions that he or she receives from various groups or individuals. And that has served us well in terms of providing transparency, and we've tinkered with that and tweaked that. And of course, you, Mr. Chair, we discussed on the House floor today more amendments to that framework, and that's, again, served us well. Most states have a combination of disclosure and limitations. They limit the amounts that an individual or an entity can contribute to campaign candidates. And in fact, Utah is one of only 4 states that has no campaign contribution limits in place at all. Back in 2008, as part of an effort to increase voter participation and the confidence that voters had in participating in not just elections but in state government, Governor Huntsman put together a commission on strengthening democracy. And by the time the commission finished its work, Governor Huntsman was gone and Governor Herbert was in place. But that commission, which was bipartisan, had legislators on it, had non-legislators on it, made unanimous recommendations. And one of the recommendations they made was to put campaign contribution limits in place for all individuals running for statewide office and for individuals running for legislative office. The campaign contribution limits would apply to individuals who made contributions to the candidates, to corporations who made contributions to candidates, to PACs who made contributions to candidates. And they were pretty straightforward. They just said, if you're running for a statewide office, the limit will be $10,000. If you are running for a legislative office, the limit will be $5,000. Now, the experience of the members of this committee may be different than my experience. My experience has been that very few, in fact, I don't know if I've ever, in running 3 campaigns for my legislative office, I don't know if I've ever received a contribution that exceeded those limits. And I would bet that most people sitting around the dais today are in a similar position, that you haven't received contributions that exceed $5,000 in a campaign cycle. I could be wrong, but in other words, my point is those limits that the Governor's Commission on Strengthening Democracy recommended unanimously were very generous limits. But they are limits, and here's what they accomplish, I think. We've seen in the experience of the past few months, the experience that we had with our last Attorney General, the influence of money in large amounts that comes from one source and the influence that can have over a candidate in terms of the candidate feeling beholden to a particular individual or a particular company or a particular PAC or a particular industry. And I think that's real. I was talking about this bill in the past, and I had one of my colleagues say to me, well, you're suggesting that we can be bought. And I said, no, it's not that at all. I don't think anybody on this committee, I certainly haven't been in the position of feeling that my colleagues were bought and paid for, that there was an exchange of money, that there were bribes taking place. I don't think that happens very often. I wouldn't say it never happens, because we have instances of it happening, although I don't recall that that's happened at the Utah State Legislature. But in other legislative bodies, that will happen occasionally. But I think that that's not the real danger. The real danger in my mind is that if you have one contribution or one contributor who has an outsized influence in terms of the amount that they're willing to contribute to you, that can't help but have an outsized influence in terms of what we as legislators do in our activities up here. That's not a good thing. And maybe more important than that is having an outsized contribution from one individual or entity to a legislator or a candidate taints the perception of that individual's integrity in the mind of the public. That's a problem. We need to do more to increase the likelihood that the public views us as acting with integrity, as being untainted by single large contributions from individuals or corporations or entities. So that's really the nature of the bill. It's relatively straightforward. We've talked about campaign contribution limits in the past. And Utah has been pretty consistent in saying, this isn't the way we want to go here in Utah. Here's why I think that should change. Our experience of the last year and the experience that we've had of, over time, states across the country, with the exception of just 4 of us, who have said, we want to combine disclosure and transparency with campaign contribution limits to basically limit the effect that money has on politics today. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and I'm open for questions from the committee.
Thank you. To the committee for clarifying questions, Representative Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple questions for you. In here, you've enumerated the different organizations and the limits related to those, and you've got one for PACs, another for an individual. Let's say that I was an individual and I contributed the limit that was found in this statute, but then I also contributed to a PAC, and then that PAC contributed to that individual. Is that permissible under this code? Or
Yeah, I think it is.
It is. Okay. Another question. What would, with the PACs, I'm looking at that, what would prevent someone from just starting another PAC once they hit their limit and using that as a tool to contribute funds to?
You could do that.
You could do that.
I mean, look, your point's well taken. Representative Peterson. I mean, this is not foolproof, not by any means. And it's similar to what happens that you see on a federal level, where you see different PACs being set up that all reflect and represent similar interests of an industry, for example. But I don't know of any way to put together a foolproof method of limiting influence. And I don't think that the perfect, I mean, we hear this all the time, perfect shouldn't be the enemy of better or an improvement. And I think that's true. This is an incremental improvement in increasing the likelihood that the public views us with integrity and views the process as being one that has greater integrity. And I think that's what we need in light of what we've seen the last year. With all due respect to our chair, who has provided incredibly important and meritorious and commendable service as the chair of that investigative committee, the work that's come out of the investigative committee, in my mind, simply doesn't go far enough to restore integrity in this political process and in the campaign process.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further discussion, questions, Representative Wheatley.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, in your testimony, you said that, well, the question I have for you, if we pass this piece of legislation, will we be perceived as untainted?
It's all incremental.
No, but
The answer to your question is no, of course not. Cynics will always be cynical.
No, the question that I have, I'm always curious about how the levels, the amounts are determined. And how did you come up with that?
The amounts that are in the bill in terms of the limits. I took them straight out of the Governor's Commission on Strengthening Democracy. I wanted to be able to come to this body and say, this isn't me speaking. This is the product, this is the fruit of the work that went into a bipartisan commission that had both R's and D's on it, that had citizens on it, that had business leaders on it. Kirk Jowers was on it. Larry Miller was initially appointed, and it was during the time that they were working that he got sick and passed away. But there were real high-profile folks on here who have good judgment and both in the legislative setting and in the business community who put those recommendations together. So I just wanted to say, look, these folks looked at this very carefully. I'm bringing it in a legislative process to the legislature.
And one last question. You mentioned that we're one of 4 states?
That's right.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Representative Pitcher.
Thank you, Representative King. I understand how perception is very important. That if they think that it's not. I can see where, in light of what's happened here in the last few months with this investigation with our Attorney General, where the public thinks that there might be this type of money, and maybe in some case there is. But I'll tell you that that might be the perception, but at least in my case, that's far from the reality. I don't get contributions near this for my campaign. But in light of how important it is that we do stand in the light, I'm not opposed to this. Absolutely I wouldn't, because it would, it's important. It's good policy. I see where you're coming. Question I have for you, and that is, where have you, we're dealing really mainly here with the campaign amount, the money's involved here. What else are you? I mean, what else? What have you found? Where's the perception? What does the public have besides the cash? What else do we need to do to make sure that we're transparent?
Well, I think we've come a long way in disclosing and being transparent, and those are very good things. I mean, as I said, the chair of the Business and Labor Committee is sponsoring a very good bill that I think passed almost unanimously, if not unanimously, the House floor today, that makes it more clear that you have to be transparent about where the contributions come from and what you're spending money on, that type of thing. That's all great.
Okay.
But I think we need to educate the public about the availability of that information. A lot of people don't know how easy it is for them to trace who's contributing to what candidate and find out who's supporting me, who's supporting you. I think that we need to educate the public, and this is part of that process.
Because I know as we, every single one of us right now on this, around this table, of course, we all report right into the state. It's there on the computer. They can see who donated to us. They can see the amount that was donated to us. They can see if there's a repetition between the very same company. I think I think we do a fairly good job of doing what we're doing to be forthcoming completely. So
I would just say this, Representative Pitcher. When this is polled, I mean, campaign contribution limits have been around for a long time. They exist, of course, at the federal level. They exist in almost every state. And they're polled, and people are asked, what do you think? Should we're one of 4 states that don't have campaign contributions. Do you think Utah should? It's a very high number who say, well, of course. We don't think somebody should be able to write a check for $50,000 or $100,000 to a candidate and say, I really like what you're doing, Representative Pitcher, I really do. And I have some dealings in areas that I have an interest in you working with me on as an elected official. Here's a campaign contribution for $50,000 or $100,000. Now, that's the perception of that is awful. And I know you, and I don't think that if that happened, I can't imagine anybody doing it, quite honestly, for you or me or anyone else on this committee. But if that happened, I wouldn't think you were being bought off or paid for. But I'll tell you, a whole heck of a lot of people who don't know you and don't know me would. And I think we need to reduce, to the extent that we can reasonably do it, the likelihood that we're perceived as being unduly influenced by large campaign contributions.
I appreciate the conversation, because that's what I want. I mean, we want more. In light of what's happened, we want to make sure that people know when they send us down here, these are people who are there and they don't represent. They're not beholden to people, that they don't have ulterior motives. And actually, the reality of life is that the money is an issue. And so I understand your direction. So thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Stannard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question, and then I'll share a little thoughts. For legislative office candidates, if a person also had a PAC, like a leadership PAC, somebody who's in leadership, like the speaker has her extra PAC, people could contribute to those separately under the proposal. I would
think
assume
so.
so as well, too. I'm a little mixed. I actually am totally, I am in complete agreement. I think we should have limits. I think there's a lot of, the image of what's shown by not having the limits is not a good thing. But what will become the common practice could become worse, which is less transparency, which is that somebody who wants to contribute $50,000 or $100,000 to a single candidate is going to find ways to just divide it up between multiple PACs, multiple sub-corporation entities, whatever, something, to be able to divide it up into smaller chunks, which almost hides the fact that it's coming from one person. And I don't know how to avoid that. And that's just as inappropriate as the other, except now it's less transparent. So,
Well, I would say this in response. It's an interesting thing to me that I saw our last Attorney General was not, he found a way around the disclosure requirements that we already have because he realized how poorly it would reflect on his campaign and his candidacy to have large amounts of money coming from various interest groups or various types of industries. So there's no campaign limit at all, and yet he still looked for a way around the existing disclosure laws. I find that remarkable. So in answer to your question, I guess I'd say if you have unscrupulous candidates, you're always going to find a way around these laws. And we see it on federal level now. So
I wouldn't, I mean, it could definitely be put onto the candidate, but I don't know that it's on the candidate as much as the person who wants to contribute that much. They'll just say, well, I'll just divide up between multiple entities or whatever and still do it anyway. And then to the people who want to look at the reporting, they see $5,000, $10,000 contributions as opposed to one $50,000 contribution, and it just doesn't look like as much impact. So I have a hard time.
You would have some people that would do that. I think most people would live within the limits, and there's the incremental improvement, I think.
Yeah. I do agree with what you're doing, though.
Thank you.
Representative Andrig.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lines 79 through 82 define the contribution cycle. Was there a particular reason you created this new definition as opposed to following the federal definition of campaign contribution cycle?
I think this has the virtue of being very straightforward. That's why. And it ties into some of the other the time frames that we have for our disclosure requirements too are tied to those same calendar years, January 1st to December 31st.
And I appreciate that. I know that on the federal level, a lot of people get around the $2,500 campaign contribution amount by donating $20,000, and then the candidate can decide that this first $2,500 goes to from convention to primary. This next $2,500 goes from primary to general election. This next $2,500 goes to, and then they assign it to each of those blocks. And I appreciate the straightforward aspect of this. When I first read your bill, I wasn't in favor of it because we're in a free society. If someone wants to give me $1 million tomorrow, give me $1 million. I'll disclose it, but I will also act within the confines of the laws, right? I'm not trying to skirt anything. However, when we passed Senate Bill 54, I don't know about the rest of you, but I came from when I won this election, the day after convention, my opponent was given a $20,000 check. And I knew I couldn't compete. And if Count My Vote initiative really goes through, this at least helps level some of that playing field. Because the concern would be then a special interest group gets on the ballot, circumvents the process, and boom, here's $100,000, here's $200,000, whatever you might need to win. This helps level the playing field.
Yeah, no, I think the prospect of having greater access and greater likelihood of primaries heightens the concern that you've identified, which is that folks with really large amounts of money can come in and just tilt the playing field significantly.
Thank you.
Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. I I think we've established here already that regardless of the limit, there's workarounds in this present system, and I think that's problematic in trying to set this up. I think the threshold's high enough this really isn't going to impact much of anybody, but I do think the solution here is transparency. And I think we've got a decent system. I think it can be improved, but I think where we improve it is with transparency. And I think that, you know, we're referencing a situation with our previous Attorney General accepting large campaign donations from a certain industry and trying to hide that and not trying to disclose that because of the check that's in place there that in disclosing that, people will know that you're receiving those contributions. And I think that's a much better solution than divvying this out into multiple accounts and instead of having a one-stop shop to clarify these things. So I personally, I don't think this would ever impact me, this limit that you've set. It's so high that there's no way I'm getting a contribution there. But I'm not comfortable with that. I do think the solution is transparency. And if we're not succeeding there, I think that's where we improve this situation, not necessarily on a limit that's so artificially high that it's really not going to have an impact. One last clarification too. You mentioned a situation where somebody says, "Here's $50,000 in exchange for your support on something." That's against federal law today. So if that's taking place, that should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and we do have laws on the books to resolve that particular issue.
Right, and my only comment about that, Representative Cox, would just be to say, where you have influence in exchange for a contribution that violates federal law is a very blurry thing. And you know, we can all envision circumstances where a contribution is made and somebody says, "I really like what you're doing, Representative Cox, and you're doing the kind of work in areas that I'm interested in a way that I want to make sure that you know you have my support." And you look at that campaign contributor and say, "Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your help, and you know, I'm glad we're on the same page." I mean, that conversation in and of itself is not going to trigger a federal investigation or charges, and yet the perception on the part of the public would be, "Oh my gosh, this candidate is beholden to that contributor." And the size of the contribution may increase significantly the likelihood, despite your best efforts to be pure in terms of doing what's good for public policy, may increase the likelihood that you feel beholden to that contributor in a way that it affects your decision making.
Yeah, and I'll just conclude with this thought. And I think that in that scenario, the constituent would look at your campaign disclosure and say, "Oh my gosh, you received a campaign donation for $10,000, and perhaps look back on your voting record and say, maybe there's a connection there." And I think there's some accountability built in, but the more transparency we have, the better. In my mind, I think that's the solution here.
We both agree on more transparency being better.
Representative McCall.
I'm just going to be brief, and I appreciate the sponsor bringing this bill. I'm not going to support the bill. I'm concerned with the limits and limiting the ability to have free speech. I understand the problem that we've gone through. I sat on the committee, and I think I was very vocal about my thoughts and opinions on the committee. During the Swallow investigation, it was very clear that he went out of his way to avoid being transparent. I don't think this helps add any transparency. I recognize the situation that Representative Andreg alluded to, but if somebody drops $20,000 in a race, that's going to show up on disclosure.utah.gov. It's there for the whole world to see. I think you can go back and trace a voting record. If I received a substantial contribution from a single group, I think that's something that the public sees, and they can judge. They can judge a candidate or a elected official on their record based on that contribution. I'm just leery that this doesn't help the transparency, and I'm not going to be supporting this.
Thank you, Representative McCall. Representative King, I'll make a comment. We have legislation this session that's working its way through the system that will link our legislative website where a person can go and find their legislator to our contributions in the Lieutenant Governor site. So that's going to make it easier. In some ways, I think having campaign limits is almost too easy. Not that you necessarily think this legislation you've done has had an easy path, but over the last several months as we've worked on the investigation, these are some of the things that I've seen. In order to appear that the money is coming from individuals rather than from entities or small amounts instead of large amounts, individuals have been given smaller amounts of money by an entity and told to contribute on behalf of that. And I've also had a tutorial on how quickly and how many packs you can set up in 15 or 20 minutes. And it's many. So I think this is my concern. The more that we try to limit or prohibit what people can contribute, I'm concerned that we'll have more hidden and dark money that we found in our investigation. They'll be incentivized to try to work around, and frankly, I think the ones that are going to do that workarounds are the ones that are going to try to contribute the larger sums of money. So I guess I'm not very hopeful that this will actually be the solution. You're correct. There were workarounds. There was a significant amount of money, what we call hidden money. There were multiple packs involved. I'm concerned that just kind of incentivizes or motivates that. And one of the things, as you know, in our legislation that we discussed today on the House floor is to require additional transparency, not only the candidate, but for the campaign consultant and others that do work for them. So, I mean, this is one method. I would just say I sat down with a person that was involved in some of the things that we've been working on the last several months, and they showed me the way to have money appear to come from multiple individuals, so it can be coming from so-called individuals or smaller amounts. And we both know that there are workarounds in anything. I'm just not sure this solved this. I think this might provide some additional impetus for hidden money. Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, do you account for, any sort of future inflation or anything in this bill at all? Or are these limits set in stone the way they are?
Right now they are.
I have a concern about that. Right now, these are good sums of money for the races that we're in, but I think, 10 years down the road, that may be different, and we would be putting in place a law that there's no way any future legislature would dare to change it. They would never be willing to do something like that, and it might have a seriously negative effect on that. I would encourage. I support the concept. I'm in favor of the bill, but I would strongly encourage you to look at doing something like that, so you're not hurting people in the future when these amounts of money may not be as significant as they are today.
I'll take a hard look at that if I can get a favorable vote out of the committee today.
Let's go to the public. Who would like to speak to this from the public? Anybody from the public? Seeing none, we'll come back to the committee for consideration. Representative Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to make a motion that we favorably recommend House Bill 297.
The motion is to recommend House Bill 297 favorably. Is discussion to the motion? Seeing none, Representative King for summation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been a great discussion. I appreciate it very much, and I appreciate the candor from the members of the committee. I think transparency is great, and you mentioned, Mr. Chair, about making it easier for people to look at the campaign contributions and tie information at the Lieutenant Governor's office and his website to those campaign contributions so that it's easier than ever for the public to find out. But here's the reality. The great majority of the people who vote for us are never going to look there. They're not going to be aware of this. Transparency, in other words, has its limits. And we all know that because our last Attorney General circumvented those transparency limits. And I am certainly not here to say that if we added to that contribution limits, an unscrupulous candidate wouldn't circumvent those too. But it's an incremental process, and I think that you are going to do better. We're going to do better as a legislature if we have transparency plus contribution limits as opposed to just having transparency alone. That makes sense to me. I think that's how the great majority of other states do it. Campaign contribution limits in other states are generally linked to having transparency also. The two work together. I think that we can make a real movement forward in increasing the likelihood that the public views us as acting with integrity if we combine transparency with campaign limits, contribution limits.
Thank you, Representative Duckworth, for some